Good morning to everybody. This is Stefano Masarengo Politics from Italy. Today we have a special guest that is Izabella Kaminska. She's the founder editor of the Blind Spot. You will find all the link about her in the chat and in the video. And the Bloomberg opinion contributor. She is also a former editor at Alphaville. So today we will have a speech about media. I will give immediately the stand to Izabella. If you have any type of question, as usual, you can post it in the chat. So I will select all the best question and I will post to Izabella at the end of her speech. If you like the content, please like the video, subscribe, ask any type that you want in the comments, and we will answer at the end of the speech. So thank you, Izabella, to be with us, and I will give you immediately the stand.
Hi. Ready to go?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm Izabella Kaminska, as already presented. So I was given a very wide, opportunity here in terms of what I wanted to talk about, and I thought I would stick to something that I at least know a little bit about, which is the state of media today and the challenges I think that journalists are facing in the current sort of social media dominated environment. I thought I would start by giving a little backstory about me, about how I came into journalism and how things have changed in my lifetime, actually. So I came into journalism doing a master's, so an academic kind of course, in which, and it was a great course. It was an institution that no longer exists, London College of Printing. And the focus of that course was very much on the sort of what I would say old school, old guard concept of what media values should be, holding power to account and objectivity. That's not to say people can't have opinions or there shouldn't be campaigning journalism, but there was, a real focus on libel, on how not to defame people, and just generally fair journalism. So you can have an opinion, but I think the general understanding is that you have to play above the belt. And that's not to say that the UK press has always played nicely, but I think, at least academically, that was the grounding that I had. And then my next sort of great journalistic experience, aside from working on local newspapers and in-house corporate, was I did a Reuters trainee course. I think that must have been around 2003, 4, maybe not, maybe a bit later, 2005. And again, that year was incredible. It was one of the best training courses I've ever had. It was really focused on, simulation type scenarios. Reuters at the time was one of the most credible wire, it still is today, wire agencies. But really very much there was a formula to how you wrote a Reuters story, and there was a clear focus on objectivity throughout the whole system. And we scenario planned. Well, we operated in sort of strange scenarios of like emerging market economies, and Reuters was always very focused on the economy as well. So that's how we got trained up. And then, long story short, I ended up at the FT via CNBC in 2008, and the early days of the FT were really amazing. And this was the early days of social media. And I think what was unique about FT Alphaville, which was a blog within the FT, is that it was very much ahead of the curve on when it came to blogging and when it came to social media. We were amongst the earliest to have social media accounts and to really understand Twitter and use any of the kind of resources that came to us from the blogosphere. Suddenly, you went from a world where journalists only had access to people through, their contact books, to a world where people were blogging online and moving markets just because they were able to speak directly to their audiences. And for a while, I think the kind of mainstream media, like the mainstream or the old guard, like the traditional kind of paper journalists, weren't, they looked down on the bloggy internet journalists. We were sort of, seen as this sort of not to be taken seriously element of the newsroom. And funnily enough, I would say soon enough, but very often what would happen is that the stories that we covered would end up circling back to the kind of newspaper journalists and editors by way of the market. But we had like spotted something in the market, blah, blah, blah. It would go into the market more broadly and then be picked up by the old school journalists who are taking, speaking to their contacts in the traditional manner. And then we'd have to point out that actually this originated from us and nobody had noticed. But that's because there was still this really broad disconnect between internet journalists and like core media newspaper journalists and even it's not that I think at the time the FT was already online, but it was a push. It was still kind of push media, which means that in the early days, I don't think the journalists are really engaging in the same way with their commenters. So Alphaville totally changed that, and we were very much focused on building a community of readers who we would engage with, and we saw it as a virtuous circle because it was very much focused on us being able to access insights from people we would otherwise not even be able to spot. But it was also clear early on that the thing was being gamed, and a good example of that was immediately, I would say, around even in the early days of 2009, whenever you wrote online about China, for example, you would see these very clearly synthetic comments appear on the FT's website on any China story, and you'd spot that they were definitely kind of biased and trying to create a false impression of things because they were badly worded and used poor grammar. But in the early days, I don't think we really appreciated the power and the potential of such kind of trolly behavior to distort the public debate. And so we didn't really have a proper policy for a couple of years, I think. And then eventually, obviously, there was an evolution and the commenters got cleverer and there was more engagement. And I think the moderation got better. But in the early days, the moderation was very light. And I think a lot of very bad stuff did filter through. Now, for an institution like the FT, knowing what to moderate and what not to moderate is really quite complex. But it's their real estate, you could say, and they have the right to dictate their own terms and governance of how you manage commenters. And I think by and large they do a good job, and these sort of dilemmas that we see now weren't so obvious back then because there was some very clear cut rules, like abusive behavior shouldn't be tolerated, and obvious spam or promotional material anything like that was very clear and could easily be moderated. But where I think we are now is that is becoming much harder because it's becoming a challenge to really differentiate between a genuine, authentic comment and who just someone who happens to disagree with you, and someone who's potentially a paid troll of the state or whoever. It's a really hard job nowadays to differentiate. But anyway, going back to where we were, I think over time, Alphaville, as the kudos associated with being an online journalist went up and up, Alphaville's position got a little bit displaced in the hierarchy because we were kind of internally seen as quite low down and externally we were developing quite a big reputation, often for being contrarians and seeing things differently. We were kind of like the FT's hedge, and that created perhaps a little bit of tension internally, because suddenly there was, whereas before sort of beat reporters were quite happy to tolerate us talking about their subjects because there was a perception no one was really reading us. I think as we came, as the online footprint and as more and more journalists became online and Twitter focused, and more journalism was being done through Twitter, we had to increasingly justify when we were talking about topics that weren't exclusively our domain. And so we ended up edging towards more polymathic themes or trends, or trying to capture news stories that weren't necessarily clear-cut sector stuff. So often like going in between different patches, like fintech is a very good example. No one was covering finance. People who were covering finance for like crypto and fintech was a technology story. People in crypto, people covering technology thought it was a finance story. So it wasn't being covered. So that became a natural kind of opportunity for us, and low-hanging fruit for Alphaville. But I think what has happened increasingly, and one of the reasons I got frustrated with, and it's not a reflection of the FT, because I think the FT is incredibly, still to this day, it is, one of the best, sources of information. The vast majority of content they do is absolutely amazing. And I really rate so many of my colleagues, but former colleagues. But I think where we have come is this, we've arrived at a situation where it's very challenging for the mainstream media to say anything that is potentially going to be seized upon by a mob, kind of a mob mentality online, because that is what is happening, and that causes the media indirectly to be a little bit more risk averse. And it also creates this weird scenario where people feel comfort in, and I would say they feel protected when they're in a crowd where everyone has the same opinion. So then, being protected by a crowd, they tend to, like, I think if you think you're part of the consensus, you can speak more boldly. And that results in some very polarizing language, which brought us kind of to 2016, where the media, I think, became entirely detached from the reality of, that most people were living through on the ground. And I myself, had a real awakening in 2016, because I, like everyone else, hadn't seen Trump coming, and I hadn't even seen Brexit coming. And I didn't expect Brexit to win, and I didn't expect Trump to win. But when they did win, I realized very clearly that, you have to adjust and understand, if you're proven wrong, you've obviously had something broken in your worldview. So you have to reanalyze all your kind of biases and perceptions. So I spent a lot of time trying to look at the other perspective, and I got very frustrated, I think, that other journalists were not doing that, and it became far too politicized. And I'm generally a very apolitical person. I'm interested in, I see myself as kind of more anthropological. I'm really interested in other people's perspectives, whether I agree with them or not. I think it's really important to see the entire picture, and as an investor especially, because if you ignore certain voices, you're never going to have a very good view on the market, because well, if you potentially run into sort of feedback loops and blowback from your own kind of non-objective status. A good example being, the current war in Russia. If you believe in your, heart, if you refuse to kind of, because you refuse to accept, say, that maybe the Russians are doing better than the media says they are. I'm not saying, this is like a hypothetical. I'm not making any judgment. I haven't been following it recently that closely. But say hypothetically, you believe, you get swept up in your own propaganda, that the Russians are doing worse than they really are, then that is going to translate into bad investment decisions, because you might think the war is going to end earlier. You'll like invest in leisure stocks or whatever instead of defense stocks. And that in the long run hurts Britain. It hurts, the West. It hurts everybody, because you are markets are then being inefficient because they're not necessarily allocating wealth as they should be based on a proper and dispassionate analysis of the situation on the ground. So I think it's really important in the financial media especially to remain sort of dispassionate and very objective. But that is much harder to do in a world where any headline you write can be seized upon by the mob to serve a political agenda. So where I think we're going now, and I think you've seen that in the sort of rise of Substack and independent journalists, is we're going to a world where uncomfortable truths or different, anything beyond consensus is increasingly being distributed to smaller audiences, mainly because the risk of, if you have only a small audience or a audience that agrees with your values, then the risk of you kind of speaking out and getting piled in on is by the internet is much lower. So you have a sort of safe space to say what you really think. Now, that's not to say, like in my case, I haven't left the FT to just speak my own, perspective to myself. The Blind Spot is actually all about diversity of opinion, and I want to hear why I'm wrong as much as, me pushing back against key arguments and presenting counter arguments. I think it's really important for me to be continuously confronted with other perspectives. And I don't think the core media does do that very well these days. So that's why I did the blind spot, because I think for investors especially, sometimes, even if it's not right, you need to understand what the other argument is. Because if you don't, you're going to have like a massive blind spot. And a good example most recently, I think, is with respect to the Russian sanctions story. And, there was definitely a perception in the early days that the sanctions would be very effective and, within no time, we would be okay, and that the West would be much better off than, basket case Russia. But in reality, as we are now seeing in Europe, the sanctions are blowing back on us in a really big way. We're facing incredibly tough winter. And I still don't think the mainstream press is being honest about the situation. Most recently here in the UK, we've had this massive debt wobble and the sterling has collapsed. But again, the media circus is hijacking, in my opinion, this is my opinion, I'm very interested in other people's opinion too, but in my opinion, it's being hijacked by Brexit debate, because that is simply the safety perspective. That to me is what most of the mainstream press thinks is the safe perspective. And so they pile in and they just repeat, and it's an echo chamber, and you just hear this parroting perspective, which whips everybody into a kind of mad reactionary whirl. And nobody's really doing any thorough or dispassionate analysis, which, in my mind, most times everything is pretty nuanced, and both sides of the argument usually have some strong points and some stupid points. So that's how I feel about the current situation in Britain. I think we're doing that very British thing of trying to outcompete each other on how crap we think we are, because the British love to be quite self-deprecating and self-loathing, very opposite to sort of the American overconfident perspective in the world. But also with respect to Italy, I think the election of Giorgia Meloni is another good example of how the media is not serving the interests of anybody, because especially when it comes to the broadcast media, no one had even heard of Meloni until last week. It was totally off the radar. It's not to say the media there weren't like stories out there if you were looking for them, but there was no push media sort of force trying to educate about what was going on in Italy. So then overnight she gets elected, and there is simply one perspective on her, which is that she's a dangerous demagogue and far right leader, which may or may not be the case. My position on this is that I don't know, because I think the media has done a pretty bad job of really looking through the complexities of what is happening in Italy. And I don't necessarily trust the media anymore to make make any sort of succinct summary assessment of the situation, because they tend to go for the path of least resistance. And Maloney, I think, is just another example of relatively sloppy journalism. It reflects, I think, and this is kind of my final point, I guess, that in the information age, the information can be out there and it can be accessible to absolutely everybody. And that is often the case these days. The information is out there, but the instinct or the compulsion to look it up is not. And so the idea that we're better informed than ever, I'm not necessarily convinced that's the case, because if you are simply looking up stories based on a reactionary function, which has very little editorial judgment, because editorial meetings these days very rarely they're much more kind of focused on how the SEO or the clicks are doing than a proper kind of thoughtful debate about what you should lead on. I think that is not necessarily good for educational, conditions, but it's also not good for democracy. And I think we journalists need to ideally work together to try and help bring nuance back into the communication field, and aim to depolarize and operate more like diplomats than as bullheaded sort of reactionary types. I think that's what I'm trying to do. And I think, when you see all these different tribes on the internet, and, they're operating very much like, what you might consider warring tribes from many years ago in medieval times, we, I think, need to kind of start to appoint sort of diplomatic embassies, almost journalistically, to sit within the different tribes. We don't necessarily agree with them, but it makes it helps us all understand where they're coming from. And that's the whole point of diplomacy, is to try and depolarize and de-escalate tensions and hopefully avert war, not move in the direction of it. And sadly, I don't think that is happening at the moment. To the contrary, most of the politicians in the West are incredibly driven by sentiment and whatever the mob is saying online. They don't stick to their principles or their policies as soon as they are seen to be unpopular. And that is not democracy to me, that is mob rule. So if I can play any small role in trying to bring a little bit more nuance and consideration and thoughtful analysis to the market, that's what I want to do. And that's the purpose of the Blind Spot. And I hope one day to extend that into a broader sort of guild structure for independent journalists, because it's great being independent, you get a lot of autonomy, but you do lose the scale and the support of being in a big institution. So it's not brilliant. Like being independent has many advantages, but it also has many disadvantages. And being a sort of unit of one or two, like on a single voice, you will never be able to be, unless you're very lucky and you end up, like a Joe Rogan type, I think you also undermine the quality of your work, because division of labor is a good idea. And so what I want to do is create a sort of more network structure for independent journalists, where people who align roughly around the same values can club together in sort of guild-like structures to share costs and certain resources and other things, and then very clearly wear their standards and their values through maybe training or passing some sort of basic skill sets and passing them on to other colleagues. Like, you wouldn't be part of the club unless you pass certain exams maybe. Then people can then, when they look online, rather than just bringing up all these random publications that no one's ever heard of, you would then have a better idea of who these people are, where they stand for, what they stand for, and what their values represent in terms of the journalistic, voice that they are presenting to the market. So that's what I hope to do. And I'm starting that by extending the opportunity to come and do training with me if anyone is interested in it, because as I scale up, I really want, I'm looking for contributors from different fields, maybe people from finance coming into journalism, but also looking for younger people wanting to get into journalism. And I realized I would have to do trainings and pass down all the knowledge that I've gained through the years from all the mentors I've had and the programs I've been on. And it would make sense to scale that up. But once people are trained in my way of doing journalism, which is very much the old heritage way I described right at the beginning of my little talk, I think we can then use that for scaling purposes in a sort of clubby way, so that people, they can maintain their autonomy and their independent voice, but they, people, when they look online, would know, oh, well, they're part of the Blind Spot, guild or whatever. And you can have competing guilds and you let the market decide which ones, if you have crazy views, you wouldn't be in my one, but like you maybe might be part of another one, and it's up to the market and the population to decide which ones work and which ones don't. So that's kind of my my spiel. I hope that has been of interest, and I think it's very important for journalism to sort itself out, because at the moment trust in journalism is very, very low. So if I can play any small role in trying to revive trust in journalism, I think it will have a positive effect on the the political polarization that we're seeing at the moment.
Perfect. So thank you so much. We received a lot of questions, so I think it was interesting for the public. For sure, we will have more views also of the video after. So I'm already asking to the viewers, if you have any question or whatever, you can post it now on the chat or in the comments of the video if you will see the video not in live. So let's start, Izabella, with the questions. So this is like from Russia. So it's like, what do you think? Not because I know that it's from Russia, but because it's one of our aficionados viewers. So I know that is from Kabardino-Balkaria. So what do you think about centralized moderation of public discourse of such a large scale as it is done on social media, with sort of traditional online forum model stretched over a large user base?
So yeah, I think there needs to be a massive rethink about how moderation happens. I think it's terrible at the moment. I think people are being penalized for expressing opinions, and there is no differentiation between opinion and sort of actual hate speech. I'm not a free speech absolutist, just to be clear. I'm a free speech maximizer, because I do think that there are fair limits on speech. I don't think it should be okay to just go around spreading lies about people with no repercussion. So I'm very much in favor of defamation and libel laws, and I'm also in favor of, limitations on people's capacity to incite violence. That is, I think those limitations are fair. But I'm not of the opinion that expressing other perspectives equates to incitement to violence just because you don't agree with people or other people's cultures or other people's ways of doing things. Unfortunately, in the media age, we are all interconnected in ways that we've never been interconnected before. That means many different cultures that don't understand each other are suddenly clashing together in the same corridor. And that's why I say it's a question of diplomacy mostly, because when you get that sort of cultural mashup, inevitably people are going to misconstrue and misunderstand, and there is going to be judgment and resentment and horrific kind of reactionary repercussions. Moderation, however, has to be evolved in a way that can respect free speech within one's own cultural tribe, but also allow for other people outside your tribe who want to understand your perspective to be able to do so. At the moment, I think that is not happening, and I'm very concerned about the repression of free speech. And when it comes to moderation, I myself have been a victim of like unilateral sort of cancellation, but through a really weird kind of mechanism that I still to this day cannot understand. My YouTube video, which at the time was a startup video channel with only 3 videos on it, suddenly it got cancelled. I got a random email saying that your YouTube has been like removed for violations. I can't remember now specific. I mean, it was very broad brush. It was something, but the point being, I didn't even understand what the violation was, and there was no appeal structure. And that to me is the biggest problem of the internet, because the internet is this kind of new sovereign body. It is, we are all operating there, but in terms of the legal structures, they're not emulating what we see on the ground in the real world. So in the UK or in the West, the concept of habeas corpus and innocent till proven guilty is a foundational part of like our entire legal system. It is so important to be presumed innocent and not guilty. But the internet system is the exact opposite. You are immediately assumed guilty until proven innocent. And there is no logical appeal path, and there is no mechanism by which to speak to a human or to understand what you've done wrong. That is incredibly powerful for the platforms. And it's also incredibly totalitarian and has the capacity to be massively abused. And I think we've seen a lot of this abuse, and we've seen, everything, when you hear about Mark Zuckerberg saying that he's had pressure from government officials to limit speech on his platforms without any strong evidence, but he had to just assume they had strong evidence. I think that's really that's a really scary scenario. And as a Pole and someone whose parents and in my younger years, I remember communism. I remember the fear that my family had of the entire kind of police and control structure in communism. It really does remind me of that sort of mentality, but in a virtual space. So yes, I'm very worried and concerned about the centralization. I don't think the system we have now works. I think moderation needs to be more bottom up. I think it needs to account for specific cultural norms, and I think it needs to operate on some sort of perspective where, as long as you flag if you flag that this community is this way inclined and that community is that way inclined, then the person being kind of upset or offended or whatever by the speech in hand, they have a right to leave. The onus should be on the person. If obviously no one wants to incite violence or defame people, that's bad, and I see the logic of immediately shutting that down. But when it's a clash of perspectives about something, absolutely not. I think you need to be welcoming to the other view, and if you're not welcoming to the other view, or you are the other view trying to butt into the other cultural view, you need to be aware, this community operates on that basis. If you don't like it, leave, go to a different community. That's how I see it. Of course, if you want to convert communities, and this is really what it comes down to, people mostly are, this is mostly a battle for hearts and minds and conversion, then do you operate on a sort of top-down, authoritarian perspective, telling people what they should think based on your own judgments, or should you really move more in the way the Catholic Church did when it sent out missionaries, which was focused more on building bridges around the things you have in common with each other rather than the differences? And that's how the mass conversions of our time have really happened, not through telling people they're idiots. So yes, big problem. But hopefully in my network structure, if it was ever to take off, this is it would be the other way around. You'd be innocent until proven guilty, and the onus and the burden of evidence would be on the accuser of your free speech being inappropriate than the other way around. And that, I think, would help reconfigure the internet in a positive and constructive way. But that's just my opinion, and obviously I'm very interested in contrarian opinions because I don't like to think of myself as in an echo chamber.
No, I'm very interested, Isabella, but also another way we will have like in the next weeks one US YouTuber that it's called Jason Inkle, like he has like a channel that it's called The Dive. For sure, it's very controversial channel, whatever, is not completely mainstream, the opposite of the mainstream information. But what happened to him, for example, or others like him, is that the platform simply demonetize the channel. So it's like, for example, like to maintain his contents and whatever, you have to move also to Rumble, or for example, to have like monetization through other platform, but not anymore from YouTube. Another question that it's like two questions that I collected in advance. It's like, what role do mainstream media and social media play in the government propaganda, both in the West and the rest of the world? And connected to this one, in the case of the Russian-Ukrainian war, given the mutual exclusion by the two blocks of the traditional media, also online, like BBC for Russia, RT for example, European Union, do you think that Telegram channels can be used to cover like propaganda as like, let's say, a new media?
So just what's the key question here? So is the key question whether propaganda is apparent in the Western structure as much as in other structures?
No, like the question is that if, for example, the Telegram groups could be used like to lead messages, also independence report, because it's mainly impossible to moderate, for example, contents through Telegram. It's not like the other channel. You can add, enter, or join the group or whatever, but you cannot cancel or do anything about these groups. And if let's say, in your opinion, like the governments are trying like to also influence information through this Telegram channel, like Russian military bloggers or also European or whatever.
See, like infiltration of these channels by governments. I mean, if that is, look, I think if that is happening, that is very unfortunate, because I think there is a rule in America, at least, that you're not allowed to do psychological operations on your own people. And when you're doing this sort of stuff, it strays into that sort of scenario. So unless you're in an actual war, which justifies war pamphleteering and the psychological morals propaganda, but then it's overt. People know, I think it's very clear, you know, we are at war, and therefore our operatives are going to be infiltrating all sorts of communication channels because it's for the war effort. And I think in that sort of situation, it's not optimal, but it's understandable because you're at war, and at least people know that that's happening, so they can be on guard and they can use their own judgment, right? But I think what's nefarious about now is that we don't really know, and no one's really supposed to be doing it officially. And when they are, you know, you can't prove they are, and so you become kind of paranoid. And to be honest, all it does is inject mass mistrust in everybody. The idea is a kind of, I'm sure there's a game theoretical sort of analogy or something, but when everyone in the group could be a possible undercover agent or undercover you know, government operative, you know, you end up with a, you know, whether they're trying to entrap you or whether they're trying to lead you or whether they're trying to change your opinion. I think that creates a real, I think that potentially is so just, you know, so harmful for the public debate, which is why we have the rules about not allowing that sort of stuff in peacetime. But again, I think it all comes down to the fact that it's very blurry whether we are in war at the moment or whether we're not in war. It's this sort of weird hybrid war that we're in. And that is going to make everyone incredibly dazed and confused. But that's kind of the objective of that sort of war. But that's why I, as a journalist who can recognize that there is just information pollution across the board, because it's not just government propagandists in the West or China or Russia. It's political parties, it's lobby groups, it's corporations. Everyone uses the same tactics. The playbook is out there, and it involves pushing your agenda wherever you are. Now, in some ways, that neutralizes the situation, but certain groups have a lot more money and power to influence things than others. So who gets harmed overall is the individual who doesn't have the big bucks to spend on campaigning for his perspective. But yeah, like, obviously, Wirecard is a big story that the FT covered, which I was on the very periphery of, but still, you know, in the background. Like, I could see, you know, I had a good idea of what was going on with that. And that's a great example of like a corporate using these horrific sort of trolley practices and infiltrating all sorts of social media to try and create a perspective and propaganda about Dan McCrum, which wasn't true. It was highly effective, and it managed to influence the entire German political class that decided to basically attack Dan instead of the company that was the fraud. So yes, it's very dangerous, and it's a sort of buyer beware, but Telegram beware scenario. Everyone has to now default to this game theoretical situation, but prisoner's dilemma, where you have to assume everyone is lying. Or potentially not being authentic. And that's really sad, because it means trust is being undermined, and all the advantages that are being brought by the internet are kind of being offset, because if you can't trust anyone on the internet, then you have no synergy and you have no capacity for cooperation. So that's the sad side of it.
If I can integrate your answer, that's what I wanted to say, and then I will move to the next question. It's like my impression is that, because let's say that I understand Russian, so I am watching also information from Russian mainstreams, whatever. Let's say that the two mainstream blocks are giving an opposite, complete, different view of the situation, completely opposite of what is happening, what is the faults or whatever. In the main thing about internet that I found is that in Telegram, as you said, there is like a pollution of information that maybe it's too much. I don't know how to explain. I joined a lot of groups, and you have alpha and omega of every news. So it's there is not what I found that it's missing. It's probably an interpretation of not mainstream information. But let's see. Next question. Okay. This one is Charles K. For the current bias that plagues the media landscape, where important stories are getting ignored, as well as a slanted form of coverage, is it due to state pressure or commercial interest? Okay. True about issues about synthetic box, that there is as we say, there is a lot of moderation of automated bots. You can see that also in the YouTube video comments. I had the same. I tried for this channel, and I found that YouTube automatically made a lot of moderation in the comments, of also comments that were not so, let's say, extreme. So I had, after the streaming, entered, because these people was saying that I was censoring him, but it was not me. So okay, this question, it's for you. What your thought about the section 230? I didn't know nothing about it, but I checked.
So I think this is the internet law that is like whether you are a utility or whether you are a publisher, right? Is that I obviously I'm not as aware, but let me
It was like a law of 1990 that no provider of user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as a publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider.
Yeah, so that is what I so my understanding of it, and I haven't spent too much time looking at it, but I think it is really interesting. I mean, I'm kind of in two minds. I mean, so the platforms want to have their cake and eat it because they want to be treated like a telephone company, and the idea of a telephone company is that the company is not responsible for the speech that occurs on its platform because it doesn't monitor and intercept, and people can talk on the phone. They say whatever they want, right? It's just a conduit for conversations that are just going to happen in the real world anyway, right? And if you are treated that way, as far as my understanding goes, you get to kind of have your cake and eat it because you don't have to worry about the kind of political bias or whatever on your platform. If you're a publisher, obviously you have a responsibility and you are held to certain accounts. You're held to account in certain standards, but policing and enforcing those editorial standards is incredibly expensive. And that's why media, by and large, is not a high profit, world, because if you are doing content moderation and all that stuff, it's incredibly expensive if you're doing it right. Now, because there is pressure for the internet platforms to kind of do something about it, they're trying to do it as cheaply as possible. So they've done all these automated tools, but that's not really an editorial process that can really determine what is and isn't, fair. You need a real human to make those assessments. But of course, if they got real humans doing it, it would undermine their profitability. And so they've outsourced it to algorithms that are doing a really bad job, and or imported like third-party kind of fact-checking entities or other editorial bodies to do it for them so that they can maintain the illusion that they are not, doing editorial stuff. But I think in both of those circumstances, that doesn't necessarily solve any of the issues. And it's more of I think there should be, the platforms should be neutral providers, basically, but they're under pressure to not be, and they're doing it, and they're going about it in the wrong way. Of course, if Section 230 was repealed, they'd have to do editorial judgment all the way through, which would, I think, and I'm thinking on my feet, I think that would be bad because they would then we'd lose our capacity to talk on neutral platforms at all. So I think actually they need to be more neutral rather than the other way around. But I might be talking rubbish because I haven't actually studied Section 230 very much in detail. So
Izabella, if I can, like to the things that you said about fact checking, because the question it's also about this, like concerning the editorial, what procedures and methodologies are used to fact check stories? Do the journalists rely on external sources like Associated Press or the research themselves? And the question is like long. And is it ethical for journalists to rely on another journalist for stories? I ask this because many times stories get copied and pasted word for word in multiple news sites, even from reputable ones.
No, absolutely. No, this happens. And this is one of my main annoyances about the current situation. And that's a function of time and the fact that journalists are really underfunded and they have certain deadlines and capacity quotas. You have to do a story a day or whatever. If you're covering a beat, why haven't you done this? Blah, blah, blah. So you take shortcuts. And that's why when I was speaking earlier, if you're taking a shortcut, you will always default to what is the most likely sort of risk like you want to default to the position that you think won't get you in trouble because you've done a shortcut, right? And you don't want to be exposed as having done a shortcut, so you will go with the consensus because then clearly you're not going to get in trouble because for not doing the work because everyone thinks the same as you. So you have this sort of safety in numbers, right? And that is really bad. So rather than like spending some time and like going through the facts and really realizing, is there something here or not, or reading the content in question, journalists are just shooting from the hip and making assumptions because it must be okay. Everyone is saying it. So 99% of the time, like when there's something very controversial, like, I mean, I don't want to bring up like some of the more controversial things, but like a good example is the Mueller report. Like most people commenting on it have not actually sat down and read it. I haven't read it. I admit I haven't read it, but I've tried to read it. It got a bit boring, so I stopped. But I think if you're going to be exclusively commenting on it, you have a duty to at least declare that you've never read it and that you are basing your judgment on other people's summaries. And so there's a kind of like chain of like with like any kind of financial transaction, there is a dilution that occurs however many parts removed from the person who's actually read the Mueller report. And it's a game of Chinese whispers, because by the time like the last person is repeating it, you've lost sight of anyone who's actually read the content. And I think that's a huge problem. And on fact checking, in the old days of Reuters, when I was there was an entire editorial kind of division called the library, and you had the resources, and you would go there and you'd have an entire kind of body of people who were responsible for checking facts and stories. And so you would ship it out and you'd be like, I need to know like the population dynamics, what the population of like blah de blah is, or what resources so-and-so country has. And you'd send that or you had the capacity to get help with your fact checking in your story by outsourcing it to this internal division. But as Wikipedia came online, that division, there is no longer any division like that. Most medias will not even have like an internal library. We did at the FT, but the library was like a ghost town. Nobody ever went to the library. I loved going to the library. I loved the library. But most people did not go to the library. They did not even like utilize it as a resource. And that's really sad, because actually that's the sort of division of labor that can really improve your story. But we are now so used to just assuming if it's on Wikipedia, it's right, and not being kind of, and I get caught out myself, and I think I'm very skeptical, but occasionally even I get caught out because I think, oh yeah, because when you see something and it feeds your bias, your inclination, this is just psychological, it's true for everybody, your inclination is to always go, yeah, that's great, see, I was right. It's never to go, haha, why is this wrong? Like, who is this source and why are they saying that? Do they have an agenda, cui bono? You don't do that, when actually you should do that. And fact checking at the moment is hugely compromised because Wikipedia itself is massively compromised. And you don't have that sort of essentially the chain has been so extended from the source point. That is a sad reality. And the other thing just to say about fact checking is that we live in a world of ambiguity, and a lot of these things are not facts. And so I get very angry when people go, oh, well, this isn't a fact. Well, it's not a fact. It's a question of interpretation. I can take the very same facts, exactly the same facts, and I can tell you two different stories with them based on how I frame them, based on what other facts I don't put in the story, and based on like the language I use and the maybes and the, coulds, so you can like dress up almost any argument with clever positioning of words that kind of caveat, and you go, well, no, I never said that it is like this. I said it could be like that. But it's on the viewer or the reader perception, it's absorbed as a fact. And because people don't know the tricks of the trade, they don't, I often am surprised that like I see what they're doing on like a big story and I go crazy because I can see that this is like a hack. This is not a fact. This is being presented. This is an opinion disguised as a fact. And that's just a function of ambiguities. And the Wuhan COVID story is a great one. because that is a massive ambiguity. We just don't know. And most people, like in the early days at least, I mean, it was insane how sure people were it came from the wet market. And I don't know whether it came from the wet market or from the lab. I really don't know. But I can say reasonably that there is a possibility that the true story isn't the mass story isn't the real one. But there is no, like, the journalists never present things in ambiguous terms, because to do so is to undermine their authority. And to say, well, actually, it could be this, but it could also be this, is really quite compromising, I think, in this day and age. So I try to be, when there's ambiguity and when certain facts can be presented in such a way where it's a mirror, like it can be this way or it can be this way, that's usually the sign of a need for balance more so than ever before, because it is no doubt a topic that has been hijacked by special interests. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I was muted. Let me put you like one question about like your past, let's say in NFT, and then I have a last two questions for the user, like to close like the stream. This one, it's like, what is your point of view of the future of cryptocurrencies? Can they really be an alternative to the traditional currencies, or they can be considered a speculation with high volatility?
I mean, the very quick answer, because this is debated for hours and for ages, is that I think cryptocurrencies are mostly speculation and volatility generators, and they don't do a lot of useful stuff. I mean, that's my position, and it's been for a long time. I think there's incredible scams going on. I think it's a wild west, and if and when regulation hits crypto, it'll just undermine the point of crypto. So crypto's only got a purpose and a raison d'etre for as long as it isn't properly regulated. And as soon as it is, it kind of, the question of why use crypto comes to mind. Most of the time it's more complex and more, you know, you can tokenize and you can do all the sort of like mass or interoperability stuff based on other information architecture. I don't think blockchains are the solution for that either. That said, I do think that something like Bitcoin, which has first mover advantage and a legacy kind of proof of work endowment, so to speak, that cannot be challenged by any other cryptocurrency simply because of how long it's been around relative to all the others. I think it's an important, I'm glad it's there, because I think it's a good and important check on government excess. And whilst I think the fiat currency models are a better model for most economies, just having Bitcoin as a backup or as an alternative, it's like, you know, I think it's good because it keeps the governments in check, potentially, knowing that there is a third option out there that is, you know, purely algorithmic, but based on sort of game theory that cannot be corrupted. I think that is a great benchmark for the world. And whether it's used on a mass scale or not, I think is irrelevant, because I don't think Bitcoin should be the standard currency for everybody. I think it should just be there as a backup when your standard currencies fail. And Bitcoin possibly serves that role. I'm not so sure about the rest. NFTs are quite interesting to me, but I think with NFTs, again, I don't think it's the blockchain that makes it, I don't think that's the innovation. I think it's a mechanism by which the art market and all the kind of content and artistic markets can come together to finally create like standards and procedures around copyright and execution of general kind of artist rights and creator rights. They can standardize it in a way that then the legal structures around it will allow, you know, if they all come together and decide that NFTs are the way the market operates, that will, just the fact they all come together in that way helps to clean up the market. But that doesn't mean it's a 100% solution, because as with the conventional market, things can go out of those monopolist, well, those kind of oligarchic settings. So it's not the control system, it's not the perfect system that people think it is, but I do think it offers an interesting pathway to digitize art and create and transfer the kind of conventional economics of art into the digital space. So I'm not anti-NFT. I'm cautiously curious, but I don't. But I kind of think it's a function of the technology having to slot in and be compatible with existing legal structures for it to really work.
I have the last two questions from the public. One is this one. How much is nepotism a problem in journalism? I look at the cases of controversial journalists like Taylor Lawrence, who have some high-placed family and gets away with infraction that can cost other jobs.
I think nepotism is quite a big problem. At least it used to be. I mean, a lot of the mainstream press are trying to change their recruitment mechanisms. But having been involved in recruitment, I think, I personally have no friends and family in media or had none when I went into media. I had no one helping me get in. I applied to the graduate trainee school. Actually, I did this MA course, and then I applied to the graduate trainee scheme, and I just applied. And someone took pity on me and hired me, right? But having been on the other side, definitely there used to be a culture where journalists would take interns of their sources if they wanted. Source would say, oh, my daughter, she'd love to be a journalist, and you do it because it was your source, so you want to keep them sweet. Or you would have the fact that so-and-so's mate is looking for a job, they're pretty good, why don't we have them? That happened a lot. It's weird though, because whilst it is an echo chamber and it's not very fair, the alternative is really hard to manage. So if you are recruiting based on word of mouth and people it's kind of the endorsement layer that comes with it that helps cut through otherwise dealing with hundreds of thousands of applications. And I think because journalism is so there are so many people who want to be journalists, that kind of works against its own interests, because people then take those nepotistic shortcuts because they can't make a proper kind of recruitment decision based on being overwhelmed by applications. And also I think the other downside of having to deal with lots of applications is it becomes a bit potlucky, right? And so you just end up kind of, I think there are talent managers being recruited now because there is such an overwhelming amount of applications, often for just a few jobs. But the other thing that's even more important for journalism is that because it's very low paid, it naturally attracts a certain class of individual, because the people who really make it in journalism are those who can afford low salaries for a long time. And there's always going to be, that's going to be a certain wealth class, which is why I think there's more diversity around minorities in the media than there is around class. So I think there's fewer kind of working class. And that's funny because back in the day, like in the 80s and the 70s, journalism was very working class profession. Most journalists didn't even go to college, right? Whereas now it's entirely different. And you've got lots of college graduates, very few working class people. And that is in itself, I think, a bit of a problem, because people like me, I don't know how I actually went through the filter, but I am a college graduate, but I didn't have any connections in. But I think that all of that sort of converges on a situation where nepotism, potluck, or just, those two are the main drivers. I mean, very occasionally there's some sort of process, but the process itself is so intensive and so expensive that not everyone can afford to do it. Oh, you're mute.
Still muted because I didn't want to disturb you. So, so I have the last question from the public, and then mine for closing. It's still about moderation, because I think that when you were talking about moderation, like a lot of questions. What do you think of an alternative to centralized moderation based on improving functionality of personalized means of moderation of feeds similar to existing block user function, but expanded include most diverse and convenient tools? Okay, and the finishing, it's like based on, say, ability to tell existing contents, flagging algorithm, what you want to see and what you don't want to see, and how should it be treated within the scope of your private feed. If I can like integrate this question, but it's very technical, I think. I'm an IT engineer, and I was a programmer and whatever. And it was very interesting that at the beginning of Google, there was another type of searching that was the mods. Also, Yahoo at the beginning was very interesting because it was a directory, it was not a search engine. So the moderation was made by human beings, not by algorithm. But as you said, these things are very expensive because you have to have like a human being that is like checking all the information and whatever. So probably like when the amount of information became millions of pages and contents, it was not applicable anymore to have like a moderator that was physically checking all the information one by one. So if you have like,
I think this question like generally is very similar to questions about law and the application of law. So I think, you know, as in the law case, the law is often fair, although I'm not sure it necessarily is in all, because moderation is obviously subjectively applied and the principles and the rules are subjective to certain platforms. But by and large, the law is often fair, but the access to the law is unfair. So because of the expense to get like some number of your peers or some sort of arbiter of the situation to get involved, that is really expensive because you're taking people out of their day jobs to do this. I mean, I was just asked to be on jury service. Nobody wants to go on jury service because it's an imposition. So you try to get out of it. The law is very expensive. Moderation is expensive. Looking at other people arguing is really annoying. And the type of people who volunteer are naturally kind of biased in the fact that they're often people with spare time, so they might be more wealthy than the people who you know who wouldn't volunteer, because most people who don't volunteer either have small kids or, you know, are poor or have other problems in their lives, right? So there you have like a very elitist sort of number of moderators, unless they're hired specifically by companies to do it, but in the kind of Wikipedia sense where they're all volunteers. And they naturally present a certain perspective, which isn't necessarily reflective of the real world, which is why we have a jury system that is supposed to be randomized and a proper cross-section of society. I don't think the internet really has that right. Now, when it comes to like a platform or real estate like the FT or the New York Times, you know, I think that's fair that they have their own people do the moderation, because that's their platform and it's their rules and their subjective values that are going to determine things. But you know what you're getting then. I think it's much more of an issue when it's on sort of perceived to be neutral platforms like Wikipedia or even sort of YouTube and you know, Twitter, which I think it is a public sphere. And I think it's very problematic when Twitter is deciding, you know, what constitutes a fact and what doesn't constitute a fact. I don't think it's up to them. I think you need to have like a public process. So when there's a story like Hunter Biden and the laptop, yeah, it's not some like mysterious, opaque, you know, body at Twitter who determines whether it's a fact or not. Maybe there should be some sort of public, you know, jury that determines whether that story should be allowed to circulate or not.
Perfect. So my final question, it's like to close the stream. It's a question that I'm used to say in all the last streams. it's like the main goal of this project, it's like to create bridges and like don't burn it. So let's hope that our work is going in this way. In your point of view, let's say that you are in UK, you are not like with UK origin or whatever, but you're from Eastern Europe. And what do you think that could be a good deal? Because now there is news of today that tomorrow there will be the Putin speech about the annexation of the four Zaporizhia, Kherson, LNR, and DPR. What could be a deal between the two parts to end the war? Because a lot of sources said that, let's say US and UK, let's say the Anglo-Saxon wants like that the war be as long as possible, like to make as weak as possible Russia. But in my point of view, let's say I'm living in Brescia, and 20 minutes far away from my town, there is like a NATO base that is Gedi with 40 B-62 nuclear bombs in a shared nuclear arsenal, and I'm a little bit worried about this situation because the Russians said that to protect like the new provinces, they can use nuclear deterrent. So what could be, in your opinion, like the red line that we can use like to create and to facilitate a deal between the two parts?
So I obviously I guess I'm not a war hawk. I'm more of a pacifist, I guess. I don't want to see war at all, but I appreciate I'm a pragmatist as well. So I realize that in some situations you can't, war chooses you irrespective of what your position is, right? So I think what I don't like about the current information environment surrounding this is the kind of escalatory dialogue you see online and the crazy talk that is gunning for a nuclear war. Like that to me is very hard to understand. And I feel this is because words have become entirely disconnected from actions. So people go around saying all these things without any evidence for X or Y being the case, or no real connection. Like there's like a disreality online that is not connected to the real world. And that is how things escalate, because there is no cost to the words that you're saying online. If you're part of an echo chamber or a mob that decides that this is the thing we want, right? There's no check on that. And that's really sad because it's very reactionary. And actually, if we had had that sort of reactionary mentality in the 80s, we probably would have had nuclear war by now, because the sort of cool-headed, nuanced perspective that wants to build bridges and be like, hang on a minute, let's settle you guys down. Let's see, that is missing from the table. So I want there to be more mediation. I think mediation is a great thing, but mediation is a dirty word at the moment, and that is the main challenge to any deal making on the Putin front. There's also no cultural kind of appreciation or respect for the idea of forgiveness, and that's understandable, because if you live in Ukraine and you've got your cousin or your father or whoever has been shot and killed, you are going to have resentment for the rest of your life. I can understand exactly why that's the case, and this is why you get the Balkans, this is why you get Afghanistan. Like there is so much pent up resentment. But I think to how can you create a mediation in that sort of environment? I mean, it's a real challenge. It's like the Middle East. There's so much now lost that you need a clean slate. But to manage and operate a clean such slate, you need some sort of third force in there that is even more That's something, you have to bring these two parties together. And I don't think kind of embarrassing Putin and getting rid of him, like, does that really serve? Is that going to change the hearts and minds of the Russian people? Even if we win the war, even if Putin is deposed, like, if they then use a democratic means to elect an equally strong man, then what is that achieved? I don't know. I don't have the answers. But I just hope there's lots more mediators in the system and back channels. And I would hope that those back channels can be, people who are of my mindset, inclined to question things and say, hang on a minute, and prevail in a reactionary environment and have some currency with the people they are advising. Because if without that sort of demographic, it might be a terrible scenario. And I think both sides need them. I don't think it's, I'm always reminded of the book. I don't know if you've read it, The Sum of All Fears by Tom Clancy. It's about.
No, I didn't read it, but I wanted to give you the last provocation of the same. Like I watched a movie that I'm from 1982. Like this movie was 1983. It's called The Day After, for the people that it's not the day after tomorrow. It's only the day after. You can search it. It's on YouTube. It's very interesting because it was about mutual nuclear destruction that could happen in the 80s. And it's located in USA, looking what happening like in a mutual nuclear attack between Soviet Union and USA. And when the people watched this movie, understood what was the huge danger to speak freely about this type of war, because it's something that in 1 second you can lose the control of the situation. And what I'm very impressed of about also a lot of media, both parts, talking so freely about tactical or strategical nuclear attacks on ground or whatever, like to use this technique that it's in the Russian doctrine, that it's called escalate to de-escalate, like to attack, make a big damage, and then negotiate. But like a nuclear attack, it's not like a candy. You cannot control everything. The winds, what is happening, blah blah blah. And it's something for me unbelievable that the people, it's like talking about it so
blasé. Yeah, I mean, I agree. The blasé approach to nuclear, like the use of tactical weapons, especially, I think, amongst sort of, the geeky kind of demographic of young, I don't know if they're young, but sort of I hate to be cliche, I don't like to be sexist, but like it is male kind of IT workers that are often very into, not just IT workers, but like I find there's a certain mentality of geek who knows all these like military. I wouldn't have been able to name any of the military equipment, right? But there's a geek element out there that does, and they're like armchair generals, and they armchair military enthusiasts, whatever. And I think none of them have probably ever been in a combat situation, and yet they are very arrogant in their assertions about what is and isn't right. I mean, generally, I'm very anti this kind of arrogant perspective. I'm interested in diffusing. I'm always interested in understanding the other perspective. I don't necessarily have to agree with it, but yeah, I think you're right, and it is scary, and it has become blasé, and we need to really have some sort of serious adults in the room talking, trying to cool things off. And I just hope they exist. So in the film Sum of All Fears, it's like the Jack Ryan character, I think, that ends up talking down like the US from doing a counterstrike, because he realizes there's like, actually it wasn't the president who ordered the nuclear attack, the president of Russia. It was one of his renegade underlings, and but he has to kind of he has to pretend like Russia ordered it, because the alternative of not owning this attack means admitting he doesn't have control of Russia. So Russian president is sort of like, yeah, no, we did do this attack, and then the Americans want to counterstrike, and then Jack Ryan figures out there's actually something else going on, and they cool things down. But I wonder whether those sorts of people exist anymore in those positions, and I just hope they do.
I checked the movie because I saw it, but I remembered in Italian that it's like al vertice della tensione. It's because the translation it's different, but I think at the moment, in my experience, that there is still this like person behind with the dialogue, especially when we're talking about nuclear. So I hope that. Especially for the normal people, if I can conclude like the stream, I have a lot of friends, both parts, Ukraine, Russia, whatever, and actually I have a lot of friends that are fleeing. I had like just a testimony like from a family that I met like in the last December, like friends, and they went in Kazakhstan by feet, crossing the border in the forest with a small child, because the man it's like 1987, so it's like possible to conscript. And in the last 10 days, I think that over 100,000 like Russians went to Kazakhstan. In Finland, from tonight, they will close the border. It was over 66,000 people. Georgia, Armenia, whatever, it's the same. So I think that it's like a national disaster in both parts, because at the beginning, all the people were like Zapubeda for the victory, whatever. But when like our volunteers were going, or Chechens, when like it became a massive war, the people start to understand also in Russia that it's not like a super holiday to go on the battleground. So I hope that all the people will like this speech. I liked a lot, because it's also about a focus that is normally not in the stories. So I appreciate a lot your time. Thanks to everybody. If you have any other question from the public, please put in the comments. I already put all the links of Izabella Kaminska, the Blind Spot, in the chat and in the video description. So go to her channel, subscribe, check her contents, and I hope that she will be able to come in our school on Lake Garda. So now I can freely speak about it, because we have already the election. So with a new parliament, I can say it. And to all the other people, just subscribe to the channel, make a like, and see you soon in the next stream. Izabella, wait a sec. Ciao.
Ciao.